Selene felt at the moment her lips left his. The kiss lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds that emptied the noise from the iron stag, stilled the warrior before her, and turned a winter solstice dare into something that would shake a kingdom. The shift in the tavern air, suddenly thick and charged, as though every torch flame had bent toward them to bear witness. She had barely pressed her mouth to his before pulling back, already smiling, already preparing to spin away victorious. But Magnus didn't smile, didn't move, didn't even breathe. He remained seated, impossibly still, his frame filling the corner like a mountain carved from stone and violence. His shoulders were broad beneath leather and chainmail, his arms scarred in a way that spoke of survival rather than decoration. This was strength that didn't announce itself, because it didn't need to. It simply existed, undeniable and dangerous. Selene's triumphant grin wavered. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had shattered something fragile and unseen. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice steadier than her pulse. "It was just a dare." His eyes lifted to her face then. Storm gray, cold as winter steel, focused with an intensity that made her skin prickle. They didn't wander. They didn't soften. They locked onto her as though he were memorizing every detail, cataloging her existence before deciding what came next. "You let your friends make choices for you," he said. His voice was low, rough like gravel underfoot. It wasn't a question. Selene swallowed, suddenly aware of how his presence seemed to swallow the space between them. She straightened her spine. "I chose to accept the dare." Something flickered in those cold eyes. Not warmth, but recognition. He studied her for another long breath, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Then he stood. The tavern went silent. Magnus rose to his full height, towering over her, and the chaos of the winter celebration simply stopped. Conversations died mid-word. Mugs froze halfway to mouths. Even the crackling of the hearth seemed muted. Selene's heart hammered against her ribs. "Be more careful who you dare to touch," Magnus said quietly, his voice carrying in the unnatural stillness. Then he stepped back, releasing her from the cage of his presence as easily as he'd created it. Selene didn't wait for more. She turned and walked back to her table on trembling legs, her friends' faces pale with sudden understanding. Behind her, Magnus remained standing, his gaze following her retreat. He didn't look away. "Before we continue, I've noticed that many of you enjoy watching my videos but haven't subscribed yet. Please help support and grow this channel by liking the video, dropping a comment, and subscribing if you enjoy the stories. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to the story. An hour earlier, the night had started so simply. The Iron Stag was packed to bursting, warm bodies pressed together in celebration of the winter solstice. The air tasted of roasted meat, honeyed wine, and wood smoke. Laughter rose in waves, bouncing off the low timber ceiling while a musician in the corner fought valiantly to be heard over the chaos. Selene sat wedged between Lyra and Kasha in a corner booth, her cheeks flushed from the heat and her third cup of spiced wine. Her honey-brown hair hung loose around her shoulders for once, freed from the severe braid her mistress demanded. The crimson dress she wore was simple, patched in 2 places, but it was hers and not the drab servant's gray she endured 6 days a week. To surviving another week in that cursed manner, Lyra declared, raising her wooden cup high. They all cheered and drank deeply. Kasha leaned closer, her dark eyes glittering with mischief in the torchlight. "Truth or dare, Selene?" "No," Selene groaned, knowing exactly where this led. "Absolutely not." "Dare," Lyra crowed. "She always picks dare when she's been drinking." Selene hesitated, the wine making her bold and reckless in equal measure. She thought of the manner, of the lady who'd struck her across the face that morning for being too slow with breakfast, of the endless gray days stretching before her. "Fine," she heard herself say. "Dare." Kasha's grin spread slow and wicked. I dare you to kiss the most intimidating man in this entire tavern." Selene followed her pointed finger. The man sat alone at a table in the farthest corner, separated from the celebration as though he existed in a different world entirely. He wasn't drinking with companions. He wasn't watching the revelry. He wasn't doing anything except sitting there, spine straight, hands resting on the scarred wood before him. He looked like death had taken human form and decided to wear leather armor. Everything about him radiated barely contained violence. Dark hair tied back from a face too harsh to be handsome. A jaw that could have been carved from granite. Scars that told stories she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Him. Selene breathed. He looks like he'd kill me before I got close enough to try. That's what makes it a good dare, Lyra said, her smile bright and utterly unconcerned with Selene's survival. Selene stared at the warrior, at the way the space around him seemed to bend, keeping the crowded tavern at bay through sheer presence alone. Every instinct she possessed screamed that approaching him was dangerous. But she was so tired of being afraid, so tired of being invisible and powerless and small. She drained her cup in one burning swallow and stood. 3 days passed before Selene stopped flinching at shadows. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, polished silver until her reflection mocked her from every surface, and kept her eyes down whenever Lady Morgrave swept through the corridors with her cutting remarks. The manor was cold stone and colder hearts, and Selene had learned long ago that the best way to survive was to make herself invisible. But invisibility required forgetting, and she couldn't forget him. Those storm-gray eyes haunted her. The way the tavern had gone silent. The strange heat that had coursed through her veins when their lips met, like lightning striking from a clear sky. She told herself it meant nothing. A warrior passing through, probably long gone by now, and she was a fool for letting a 3-second kiss consume her thoughts. She was carrying linens to the wash house when the commotion erupted at the front gates. Raised voices carried across the courtyard. Lady Morgrave's shrill demands. The nervous stammering of Willem, the gatekeeper. And beneath it all, a voice that made Selene's hands go still on the basket she carried.
Deep. Calm.
Unyielding. She shouldn't have looked. Should have kept walking, kept her head down, stayed invisible as she'd been taught. Instead, she found herself drawn toward the manor's entrance like a moth to deadly flame. Magnus stood at the gates as dusk painted the sky in shades of blood and bruise. He looked exactly as he had in the tavern, all lethal grace and barely contained power, except now he stood in her world, making the manor's stone walls seem suddenly fragile. His dark hair was loose around his shoulders, and he wore a heavy cloak over his leather armor, but nothing could disguise what he was. Dangerous. Lady Morgrave blocked the entrance, her face mottled with rage. I don't care who you think you are. We don't allow riffraff to harass our servants. Leave before I summon the guards. Then summon them, Magnus said without inflection. His gaze moved past the lady as though she were merely an obstacle, scanning the courtyard until it found Selene frozen 20 paces away. Something flickered in those gray eyes. I'm not leaving until I speak with her. Selene's heart stopped, then started again too fast. Lady Morgrave followed his gaze, and her expression curdled further when she saw Selene. What have you done, you stupid girl? What trouble have you brought to my door? None, my lady, Selene managed, though her voice felt thin. I don't know what he wants. One evening, Magnus said, his attention still locked on Selene with unnerving intensity. A few hours of conversation. That's all I'm asking. Absolutely not, Lady Morgrave snapped. She has work. I'll compensate you for her time. Magnus reached into his cloak and produced a small leather purse. He tossed it to Willem, who caught it reflexively. The weight of it made the old man's eyes widen. That should more than cover any inconvenience. The coins inside clinked with a sound that made Lady Morgrave's protest die unspoken. Greed and fury warred across her pinched features. Magnus took a single step forward, and suddenly the space felt smaller, the air heavier. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm not a patient man, and I've asked politely. Don't make me ask again. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise wrapped in silk-soft menace. Lady Morgrave's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Finally, she jerked her head toward Selene. Go. Be back before dawn, or don't bother coming back at all. Selene stood rooted to the cobblestones, her mind screaming warnings even as her feet began to move. She crossed the courtyard slowly, feeling every eye upon her until she stood before Magnus at the gates. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. Heat radiated from him, and that strange pull she'd felt in the tavern wrapped around her like invisible chains. Why? She asked quietly. Why are you here? Magnus studied her face, as though memorizing it. Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you walked away. His hand lifted slightly, then dropped back to his side, as if he'd barely stopped himself from touching her. Walk with me, Selene. Just for tonight. I promise you'll be safe. She should have said no. Should have run back inside and bolted the door and never thought of him again. Instead, she stepped through the gates. Magnus led her into the forest without a word, his stride purposeful and sure even as darkness gathered between the trees. Selene followed, acutely aware of the space between them, the way he adjusted his pace so she could keep up without running. The manor disappeared behind them, swallowed by ancient oaks and the descending night. They walked until the trees opened onto a clearing she'd never seen before, though she'd lived within walking distance her entire life. The full moon hung impossibly large overhead, bathing everything in silver light. Frost glittered on the grass like scattered diamonds. How did you find this place? Selene asked, her breath misting in the cold air. I have a talent for finding things others overlook. Magnus turned to face her, and in the moonlight his features seemed softer somehow, less like carved stone, and more like something that might once have been human. Sit with me? It wasn't a command. It was a question, offered with unexpected gentleness. They settled on a fallen log at the clearing's edge, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not quite touching. For a long moment, neither spoke. The forest breathed around them, alive with small sounds and the whisper of wind through bare branches. You asked why I came, Magnus said finally. The truth is, I don't entirely understand it myself. That kiss. He paused, jaw tightening. It changed something. I felt it the moment your lips touched mine. Selene's heart stuttered. I felt it too. Like lightning in my veins. The mate bond, he said quietly. I'm an alpha. You're an omega. What you felt was recognition. The word hung between them, heavy with implications she couldn't quite grasp. I don't understand. Neither do I, completely. Magnus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring out at the moonlit clearing. I've spent 30 winters walking this earth. I've seen things that would break most men. Battles that painted the snow red. Friends who became enemies. Enemies who became corpses. His voice was distant, haunted. I built walls around myself because every time I let someone close, they either betrayed me or died. I stopped believing in anything soft or good. Selene found herself leaning closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his words. What changed? You. He turned his head, those storm-gray eyes finding hers. You walked up to me like you had every right to exist in my space. Kissed me like it meant nothing and everything at once. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than emptiness. She should have been frightened by the intensity in his gaze. Instead, she felt her own walls beginning to crumble. I'm nobody, she whispered. Just an Omega servant who scrubs floors and keeps her head down. I don't have grand stories, or... Tell me what you dream about, Magnus interrupted. When you're scrubbing those floors and Lady Morgrave isn't watching, what do you imagine? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. Freedom, she admitted. Purpose. Being more than invisible. I dream about mattering to someone, about doing something that changes things instead of just surviving them. She laughed bitterly. Foolish dreams for someone like me. Not foolish. Magnus' hand moved, his fingers brushing her jaw with startling tenderness. Never foolish. The touch sent electricity singing through her nerves. Selene's breath caught as he leaned closer, giving her time to pull away, to stop what was happening. She didn't move. Couldn't move. Didn't want to. When Magnus kissed her, it was nothing like the brief press of lips in the tavern. This kiss was deliberate, consuming, a claiming and a question all at once. His mouth moved against hers with controlled hunger, and Selene felt that strange heat from before explode into an inferno. The bond between them pulled taut, singing with recognition and need. She kissed him back with all the desperate longing she'd buried beneath years of servitude, her hands fisting in his cloak. Magnus made a sound low in his throat, almost a growl, and deepened the kiss until she forgot about the cold, the forest, everything except the feeling of rightness settling into her bones. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Magnus rested his forehead against hers. "This is dangerous," he said roughly. "Everything about this is dangerous. But I can't walk away from you." "Then don't," Selene whispered, even though she didn't understand what she was agreeing to, only that turning back now felt impossible. Under the wolf moon, something ancient and undeniable sealed itself between them, and neither one of them would ever be the same. The weeks that followed existed in stolen moments and secret meetings. Magnus came to her at dusk when Lady Morgrave's attention was elsewhere, appearing like a shadow at the edge of the manor grounds. Sometimes they walked through the forest, his hand warm around hers. Other times they simply sat in the clearing under the stars while Selene talked about her day, and Magnus listened with an intensity that made her feel like every word mattered. The bond between them grew stronger with each meeting, an invisible thread pulling tighter until Selene couldn't imagine a day without seeing him. She didn't ask about his life beyond their meetings. Some instinct told her the answers would shatter the fragile perfection they'd built. Tonight, Magnus had brought her to an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the woods, a place with 4 walls and a fireplace that still worked. He'd built a fire while she explored the dusty interior, marveling at this sanctuary he'd somehow found for them. "You're shivering," Magnus said, appearing behind her with his cloak. He draped it around her shoulders, and the weight of it felt like being wrapped in safety itself. "I'm fine," Selene protested, but her teeth chattered and betrayed her. Magnus' expression softened in that way it only did when they were alone. "Come here." He settled by the fire and pulled her down beside him, his arm coming around her shoulders. Selene melted into his warmth, resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, and feel the rise and fall of his breathing. Her hand rested on his abdomen, and she felt him tense slightly beneath her touch. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking up at him. "Nothing." But his jaw was tight, and there was something guarded in his eyes that hadn't been there moments before. Selene sat up slightly, her hand moving beneath the edge of his tunic, before he could stop her. Her fingers found ridged tissue, thick and twisted. She pushed the fabric higher, and Magnus caught her wrist, but not before she saw.
Scars. Dozens of them.
His torso was a map of violence, pale lines crisscrossing his skin in patterns that spoke of blades and claws and things that had tried very hard to kill him. Some were thin and surgical. Others were jagged, brutal, the kind that came from surviving what shouldn't be survived. "Magnus," she breathed, horror and understanding dawning simultaneously. "What are these?" "The price of a life I lead." His voice was carefully neutral, but she felt the tension thrumming through his frame. "I told you I've seen battles. I didn't say I walked away unscathed." Her fingers traced a particularly vicious scar that ran from his ribs to his hip. This wasn't from battle. This was meant to kill you. Yes. And this one? She touched another across his shoulder blade, feeling the way the muscle beneath had healed wrong. Assassination attempt. I was 19. Magnus caught her hand, stilling her exploration. Selene, the things I've done, the life I've lived, it's darker than you understand. Then help me understand. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. You're not just some warrior, are you? These scars, the way people react to you, the coin you carry. Her breath caught as pieces began clicking into place. Who are you really? Before Magnus could answer, a sharp whistle cut through the night outside the lodge. He was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from gentle lover to lethal predator in the space of a heartbeat. His hand moved to the blade at his hip, and Selene realized with a chill that she'd never seen him without a weapon. Stay here, he commanded, and this time there was no question in his voice. This was the voice of someone used to being obeyed, without hesitation. He moved to the door and opened it to reveal a man waiting in the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same dangerous grace Magnus possessed. The stranger's eyes swept the lodge, lingering on Selene with sharp assessment before returning to Magnus. We need to talk, the man said quietly.
Now.
Theron. Magnus' voice carried warning. This better be. The court is fracturing without you, Theron interrupted, his voice low and urgent. 3 of the border lords have refused to answer your summons. Lady Ivana's father is making moves, and the council wants to know where their king has disappeared to. The word hung in the air like a death knell.
King.
Selene's world tilted violently. She stared at Magnus' back, at the set of his shoulders, and understood with perfect, terrible clarity why he'd never answered her questions. Why the tavern had gone silent. Why Lady Morgrave had backed down. Why everything about him screamed power and danger. Magnus turned slowly to face her, and in his storm-gray eyes she saw confirmation of every impossible truth. Selene, he said quietly, and there was something almost like fear in his voice. Let me explain. Selene couldn't breathe. The walls of the hunting lodge pressed in on her, the firelight suddenly too bright, too hot.
King.
The word echoed in her skull like a death knell. She'd kissed a king, touched a king, fallen for a king while he played at being something less. You lied to me. Her voice came out strangled, small. Every moment we spent together was built on lies. The feelings weren't lies, Magnus said, taking a step toward her. Everything between us was real. Was it? She backed away, bumping into the rough wooden wall. You let me talk about my pathetic dreams and my miserable life while you. Fury and humiliation burned through her chest. You're the Alpha King. You could have anyone. Why would you even? Because you're my mate, Magnus growled, his control fracturing. Because from the moment you kissed me, nothing else mattered. Not the crown, not the kingdom, not. The door burst open before he could finish. 6 armed guards poured into the lodge, their armor bearing the royal crest Selene had seen on banners in the town square. They moved with military precision, surrounding Magnus while carefully avoiding actually touching him. Your Majesty, the captain said, his voice tight with barely contained disapproval. The council demands your immediate return. The situation has become critical. Your Majesty. The words were knives twisting in Selene's chest. Magnus' expression went cold, regal, and Selene saw the king emerge fully for the first time. I'll return when I'm ready, Captain. With respect, Your Majesty, you don't have that luxury. The captain's gaze flicked to Selene, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. The kingdom comes first. Something in those words broke whatever tether held Selene to the spot. She moved, darting toward the door with desperate speed. If she could just reach the forest, disappear into the darkness. Selene, stop. The command hit her like a physical force. Her body obeyed before her mind could protest, freezing mid-step. The Alpha command. She'd heard stories of it, but never felt it. The overwhelming compulsion to obey that an Alpha could wield over an Omega. Magnus crossed to her in 3 strides, his hand closing gently around her arm even as fury and desperation warred in his expression. "Don't run from me. Please." "You commanded me," Selene whispered, tears burning her eyes. "You used your power to. Because you were about to run into the forest in the middle of the night where I couldn't protect you." Magnus turned her to face him, his other hand cupping her jaw. "I deceived you about who I am. I own that. But everything I feel for you is real. The bond between us is real. You are mine, Selene, and I am yours. That truth exists whether I'm a warrior or a king." "Your Majesty," the captain said again more urgently. "We must leave now." Magnus didn't look away from Selene's face. "She comes with me." Shocked silence filled the lodge. "Your Majesty," Theron said carefully, "bringing an unmated Omega of common birth to the palace, the scandal alone would, is not a request." Magnus' voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "She's under my protection. Anyone who questions that answers to me." The captain's jaw tightened, but he bowed stiffly. "As you command, Your Majesty." Selene wanted to protest, to scream that she wouldn't go, that he couldn't just drag her into his world because he commanded it. But looking into Magnus' storm-gray eyes, she saw something that made her hesitate. Not arrogance or entitlement, but naked desperation. The same fear she felt reflected back at her. "If I go with you," she said quietly, aware of every guard listening, "I go by choice. Not because you commanded it." Something in Magnus' expression eased. "By choice," he agreed. "Always by choice, Selene." She should have said no. Should have run back to the manor and pretended none of this had happened. But the bond between them pulled taut, and beneath her anger and fear lived the undeniable truth that she couldn't walk away from him any more than she could stop breathing. "Then I choose to go," Selene whispered, even as her world tilted into something vast and terrifying. "But you owe me answers. Real ones." Magnus brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a vow. "You'll have them. All of them. I swear it." The guards formed up around them, and Selene found herself being led out into the night toward a future she couldn't imagine, with a man she loved and barely knew, into a world that would see her as nothing more than a common Omega foolish enough to capture a king's attention. Behind them, the hunting lodge stood empty, the fire dying to embers, a sanctuary that had lasted only until the crown's shadow found them. The palace was a monument to power and cruelty carved from white stone and malice. Selene stood in the chambers Magnus had assigned her, staring at walls hung with tapestries worth more than everything she'd owned in her entire life. The bed could have fit 6 people. The wardrobe held gowns she didn't know how to wear. And beyond her door, she could hear whispers following her like poison. She'd been at court for 3 days, and already she understood she was prey. The noble ladies were the worst. They moved in packs through the palace corridors, their silk gowns rustling like serpent scales, their laughter sharp as knives. Lady Ivana led them, a striking alpha woman with midnight hair and ice-blue eyes who looked at Selene like something stuck to her shoe. "How quaint," Lady Casterine had said that morning in the breakfast hall, her voice carrying perfectly. "His Majesty keeps pets now. I wonder if she's been trained to fetch." The other ladies had laughed, and Selene had forced herself to keep walking, head high, even as humiliation burned through her veins. Now she stood at her window overlooking the gardens, trying to steady her breathing, when voices drifted up from below. She recognized Theron's measured tones and the sharper voice of Lord Chancellor Aldrich. "This infatuation is becoming a liability," Aldrich said. "The border lords are questioning his judgment. Lord Castellan has withdrawn his support entirely. We need Magnus focused on securing the alliance with House Thornwick, not distracted by some common Omega he can barely keep his hands off. He won't send her away, Theron replied quietly. I've known Magnus for 15 years. I've never seen him like this. Then we remove the problem ourselves. A new voice, cold and female. Lady Ivana. An Omega servant found dead in her chambers. Tragic, but hardly surprising in a palace with so many dangers. His Majesty would mourn briefly and move on. Selene's blood turned to ice. You speak of murder as though it were nothing, Theron said, and there was steel beneath his words now. I speak of necessity, Ivana countered. My father commands 3 of the largest armies in the realm. Our marriage would unite the kingdom. This girl threatens everything we've worked toward. Tell me, Beta Theron, what's one Omega's life weighed against stability? Selene backed away from the window, her heart hammering. She needed to leave.
Now.
Before they realized she'd heard before, her door opened and Magnus strode in, followed by 2 massive guards in black armor. His storm-gray eyes swept over her, and whatever he saw on her face made his expression darken. What happened? It was a command, not a question. I can't stay here. Selene's voice shook despite her efforts to steady it. They want me dead, Magnus. Lady Ivana just. I know. Magnus closed the distance between them, his hands framing her face. I've known since the moment we arrived. That's why these men are here. He gestured to the guards. Garrett and Kale. They're my most trusted. They'll shadow you everywhere, and they answer only to me. That won't be enough, Selene whispered. You heard what they said about the border lords, the alliances you need. I'm destroying everything you've built. They're wrong. Magnus' thumbs brushed away tears she didn't realize had fallen. You're not destroying anything. You're giving me a reason to care about what I'm building. He turned to address someone in the doorway, more guards, advisors gathering like wolves scenting blood. His voice rose, carrying through the chambers and beyond. Let me make something clear to everyone listening. Selene is under my personal protection. She is not a passing fancy or a momentary distraction. Any threat against her is a threat against your king, and I will respond accordingly. Lord Chancellor Aldrich appeared in the doorway, his face mottled with barely contained fury. Your Majesty, this is madness. The noble houses can adapt or be replaced. Magnus' expression was brutal, the ruthless King Selene had only glimpsed before. I've built this kingdom through blood and steel. I don't need their approval, and I certainly don't need their permission to choose who I keep close. You would risk everything for an Omega? Lady Ivana's voice dripped with disdain as she pushed past Aldrich into the room. Magnus turned to face her, and the temperature seemed to drop. I would burn this palace to the ground before I let anyone harm her. Do I make myself clear, Lady Ivana? The noblewoman's face went pale, but her eyes promised murder. As the room slowly emptied under Magnus' cold stare, Selene understood with perfect clarity that this was only the beginning. They declared war, and she was standing at the center of a battlefield she didn't know how to navigate. Magnus pulled her close, and she felt his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong. I won't let them touch you, he murmured into her hair. I promise you that. Selene wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the vipers in his court, and she knew that promises, even from a king, might not be enough. The great hall had been built to intimidate, and it succeeded magnificently. Selene stood at Magnus' side on the raised dais, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes fixed on her with expressions ranging from curiosity to naked hostility. The kingdom's most powerful families filled the hall, alphas in ceremonial armor, their mates dripping with jewels, advisors and warriors and nobles whose bloodlines stretched back centuries. Banners bearing ancient house sigils hung from the vaulted ceiling, and torches cast dancing shadows across stone walls that had witnessed coronations and executions in equal measure. Magnus stood like a statue carved from violence itself, his presence commanding absolute attention despite his silence. He wore full royal regalia, black and silver, a crown of twisted metal that looked more like a weapon than an ornament. This wasn't the man who'd held her gently in the moonlight. This was the Alpha King, and he was terrifying. "We are gathered," Magnus' voice rang out, cutting through the murmurs, "to witness a declaration that will shape the future of this realm." The hall fell silent. Selene felt her heartbeat in her throat. "I claim Selene of No House as my mate and future queen." Chaos erupted. Nobles surged to their feet, shouting over each other. Lady Ivana's face went white with rage. Lord Chancellor Aldrich looked like he might be sick. But it was Lord Castellan, Ivana's father, whose voice cut through the din like a blade. "You cannot be serious." He strode forward, his massive frame bristling with fury. "An Omega? A common servant with no bloodline, no training, no worth beyond what any Omega possesses? You would make her queen?" "I would," Magnus said, his voice deadly quiet. "And I am." "Then you're a fool," Castellan spat. "The noble houses will never accept this insult. You spit on centuries of tradition, on alliances built in blood. For what? A pretty face and convenient heat? We know what Omegas are good for, your majesty, and it isn't wearing a crown." Selene felt the words like physical blows, but before she could respond, Magnus moved. He descended from the dais with predatory grace, and the crowd parted before him like water. "Say that again," Magnus said softly, stopping mere inches from Castellan. "Question her worth one more time." The tension was unbearable. Castellan's hand moved toward his sword, and Selene saw murder in his eyes. The arrow came from the shadows near the eastern gallery. Selene saw it for a heartbeat, the shaft catching torchlight as it flew, aimed directly at her heart. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only watch death approach. Magnus spun impossibly fast, his hand shooting up to catch the arrow inches from her chest. The wood splintered in his grip. Then he moved. Selene had never seen anything like it. Magnus became a force of nature, crossing the hall in seconds. He grabbed the assassin, a man in servant's clothes, and slammed him against the stone pillar hard enough to crack bone. The man's neck snapped with an audible sound that silenced every voice in the hall. Magnus let the body drop and turned to face the assembly, blood on his hands, his eyes blazing with primal fury that made every person in the hall take an involuntary step back. "Garrett," he said, his voice carrying. The three men near the western door. Kale, the woman in green by the pillar. All of them were watching the assassin's position. All of them knew. His guards moved with brutal efficiency. Screams erupted as the conspirators were dragged forward and forced to their knees before the dais. Lady Ivana's face had gone gray. Magnus walked to each conspirator in turn. He didn't hesitate, didn't offer them a chance to speak. His blade, the ceremonial sword he'd drawn from his belt, flashed 3 times, and 3 heads rolled across the marble floor. The great hall was silent as a tomb. Magnus turned to face the assembled nobles, covered in blood, terrible and magnificent. "Let me be absolutely clear. Selene is my mate. She will be your queen. Anyone who threatens her threatens me. Anyone who harms her signs their own death warrant." His gaze swept across every face. "I am called the Ruthless King for a reason. Test me on this, and you will learn exactly how I earned that name." No one spoke. No one moved. Magnus walked back to the dais, his hand extended to Selene. She took it with trembling fingers, and he pulled her close, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "You're safe now. I swear it." Selene looked out at the hall full of nobles, at the bodies on the floor, at the fear and hatred in 100 pairs of eyes. Safe was a relative term. But as Magnus' arms closed around her and the bond between them burned bright and unbreakable, she realized something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just surviving. She was fighting back. The great hall was cleaned by dawn, but the memory of blood on marble would linger far longer. In the weeks that followed, 7 noble families withdrew from court. They left quietly, without ceremony, taking their armies and their loyalty with them. Lord Castellan was among them, his daughter Ivana gone before Magnus could decide whether her involvement warranted execution or exile. The palace felt emptier, the shadows deeper. But something unexpected happened in that emptiness. Those who remained began to watch Selene differently. They saw her moving through the palace with Garrett and Kale at her shoulders, her spine straight despite the whispers. They saw her in the council chambers, listening with quiet intelligence as Magnus' advisors argued strategy. And they saw the way the ruthless king softened when she entered a room, the way his eyes tracked her like she was the only star in his sky. Selene discovered something she'd never known about herself. She was good at this. Where Magnus ruled through strength and fear, she moved through the court like water finding cracks in stone. She spoke with the servants who others ignored, learning the palace's true rhythms. She sat with minor nobles who'd been overlooked, listening to their grievances with genuine care. When Lady Morvain's son fell ill, Selene spent 3 nights at the boy's bedside, her Omega instincts somehow soothing his fever when the healers had failed. Word spread. The common Omega who'd captured a king's heart wasn't as powerless as they'd assumed. "You're healing what I broke," Magnus said one evening, watching her from across their shared chambers. They'd been living together for 2 weeks now, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing day. "You protected me," Selene replied, crossing to him. "I'm just showing them that we're stronger together than we ever were apart." Magnus pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," she agreed with a small smile. "But you're stuck with me anyway." The mating ceremony was held on the winter solstice, exactly 3 months after a reckless dare in a crowded tavern had changed everything. The entire pack gathered in the palace courtyard under a moon so full and bright, it painted everything silver. Nobles and commoners stood side by side, all ancient grievances momentarily forgotten in the presence of something primal and sacred. Selene wore a gown of deep crimson and winter white, her honey-brown hair woven with silver threads. A crown rested on her head, smaller than Magnus, but no less significant. Magnus stood before her in the moonlight, and for once, every wall he'd ever built was down. She saw him completely. The warrior, the king, the man who'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be whole. Then, as the pack watched in stunned silence, the Alpha King knelt. "I offer you more than my heart," Magnus said, his voice carrying across the hushed courtyard. "I offer you my loyalty, my protection, my kingdom. Everything I am, everything I have is yours. I kneel before you not as king to subject, but as mate to mate, alpha to omega, asking you to accept the bond between us and make it unbreakable." Selene's hand trembled as she reached out, placing it gently on his head in the traditional Omega blessing. The bond between them flared to life, brilliant and consuming, a connection so deep it felt like their souls had been waiting lifetimes to finally merge. "I accept," she whispered, and power flooded through her, his strength becoming hers, her compassion becoming his, 2 halves finally made whole. "I accept your heart, your loyalty, your kingdom, and I offer you mine in return. Rise, Magnus. Not as my king, but as my mate." He rose, and when he kissed her, the pack held their approval to the winter sky. Dawn found them on the palace battlements, watching the sun paint the kingdom in shades of gold and rose. Magnus stood behind Selene, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. The crown on her head caught the morning light. "Do you regret it?" Magnus asked quietly. "The dare that brought you to me?" Selene thought about the terrified Omega servant who'd walked into that tavern 3 months ago, desperate for one night of freedom. She thought about the ruthless warrior who'd stood when she kissed him, the king who'd killed to protect her, the mate who'd knelt before her and offered her the world. "Not for a single second," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "You?" Magnus smiled, a real smile, soft and devastating. "Best 3 seconds of my life." Below them, the kingdom stirred to life. There would be challenges ahead, enemies who would never accept an Omega Queen, battles yet to fight. But standing together on those battlements, Alpha and Omega, King and Queen, they were ready for whatever came next. After all, they'd already survived the impossible. Everything else was just details. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, please like the video, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly means the world to me and helps this channel grow. Thank you for being here.